Imagine a 7-year-old Girl Scout in a quiet neighborhood on Holy Thursday of 1973. She leaves home with 2 boxes of cookies to sell, her uniform, and a smile. 2 hours later, she is no longer breathing. Her body would only be found on Easter Sunday, hidden under rocks in a distant park. What happened during that time? And how could her killer be the man who lived just a few steps from her house? This is the story of Joan D'Alessandro, the girl whose death would trigger one of the biggest changes in American legislation on crimes against children. April 19, 1973. Joan D'Alessandro, dressed in her Girl Scout uniform that she was so proud of, enters the house at 2:40 in the afternoon to tell her mother, "Mom, I'm going to the neighbor who bought the new car to sell just the last 2 boxes of cookies." Joan was known as the social butterfly of the school, always attentive to make sure no one was left alone, always mediating conflicts. The teacher said Joan had a gift for making friends and helping others. Those would be the last words her mother, Rosemary, would hear from her. When the girl didn't return after an hour, Rosemary wasn't immediately concerned. The Hillsdale neighborhood in New Jersey was considered extremely safe, so safe that even an FBI agent and a minister lived there. Children played freely in the streets. Everyone knew each other. But at 4:40 in the afternoon, when the piano teacher of Joan's older sister arrived, a dark premonition took hold of Rosemary. She began frantically calling her daughter's friends. No one knew where Joan was. The father, Frank D'Alessandro, an Italian with a normally reserved temperament, was visibly in shock. He immediately went out with his other 2 children, 8-year-old Mary and 9-year-old Frank Jr., to search for the girl in nearby neighborhoods. A crucial detail came back to Rosemary's memory. Joan had mentioned a neighbor with a new car. There was only one family in the neighborhood that had recently acquired an automobile, the McGowans. With her heart racing and a bad feeling, Rosemary went to their house, accompanied by her son. Something made her leave the boy in the yard, perhaps a maternal protective instinct, while she climbed the entrance stairs alone. Joseph McGowan, a 27-year-old science teacher, answered the door. "Was Joan here?" asked Rosemary, trying to keep her voice steady. "No," he replied dryly. But something in his eyes, in the coldness of his posture, made Rosemary's blood freeze. When he saw police officers arriving at his own door, McGowan just continued smoking his cigar, indifferent to the despair of the mother whose eyes were already overflowing with tears. He simply went upstairs, as if the unfolding drama did not concern him. Rosemary felt she needed to leave immediately. What she didn't know, what no one yet suspected, was that her little Joan had been dead for hours, and her killer had just closed the door. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button now and activate the bell. Your support is fundamental for us to continue bringing cases like this. Soon after Rosemary realized her daughter was missing, hundreds of people mobilized to search for her. Neighbors, police officers, firefighters, and even Joseph McGowan himself, the actual killer, joined the search. Tracking dogs were taken to the family's laundry basket to pick up Joan's scent. Curiously, the dogs always went to the front door and the back door of McGowan's house where the garage was, but nothing was found at that time. The disappearance of a 7-year-old child quickly spread, and various TV stations and reporters arrived in the neighborhood. Rosemary didn't mind giving interviews to everyone, believing that the more people who saw her daughter's photo, the greater the chances of finding her. The father, Frank, made an emotional appeal on television. "If you have my daughter, please return her. There will be no charges, you won't be arrested. We just want our daughter back alive and well." The Hillsdale sheriff, who was on vacation, returned immediately when he learned about the girl's disappearance in the county he supervised. He went to the family's house, and although he also had the feeling that something terrible had happened, promised to do his best to find Joan without giving false hopes that everything would be all right. The case made local headlines. Rosemary gave interviews to any media outlet that appeared, desperate for someone, somewhere, to have seen her daughter. Frank, in a televised plea that broke hearts, looked directly at the camera. "If you have my daughter, please return her. There will be no charges, you won't be arrested. We just want our Joan back alive and well." His voice broke on the last sentence. 3 suspects initially emerged. 2 were quickly dismissed: a young man looking to rent a house in the area and a lost man walking around the neighborhood. The 3rd suspect was Joseph McGowan. During 2 days of interrogation, his answers crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions. He claimed not to be at home when Joan disappeared, saying he had gone to the market on foot, despite his car being in the garage. "Which market did you visit?" "I don't remember." "What did you buy there?" "Meat and apples." "Where are the receipts?" "I don't have them." "Where is the food?" "We've already eaten everything." McGowan had no alibi. His mother was at work when Joan disappeared. His grandmother, an extremely elderly, sick, and almost deaf lady, remained confined to her room on the upper floor of the house. Too convenient not to hear the screams that certainly occurred. Subjected to a lie detector, McGowan failed spectacularly. The investigators were direct. "You failed these specific questions. Do you want to tell us something?" McGowan hesitated, his face pale, and then made a surprising request. "Can I speak with a priest?" After a long conversation with the religious figure, the truth finally emerged in a horrifying confession. Yes, he had killed Joan. And worse, he had left her body in a park, across the border with the state of New York. Sheriff Farisco took on the most painful task: informing the parents. When he arrived at the D'Alessandro house, he found Rosemary accompanied by the local priest. Upon hearing that her daughter was dead, murdered by the neighbor, Rosemary exploded, "I want to kill." "Joseph!" The priest tried to calm her, to which the sheriff himself retorted, "Father, how can she be calm? She just lost her daughter." On Easter Sunday, while families celebrated the resurrection, a police team and the medical examiner headed to the location indicated by McGowan. The contrast could not have been more cruel. Among the stones of a deserted park, under 2 large rocks with only a small exposed gap, they found what remained of Joan D'Alessandro. She was naked, her body already in sync with the ambient temperature, dead for at least 36 hours, which meant she had been murdered just a few hours after leaving her house on Thursday. The medical examiner, a father of 4 young children, would later describe that moment as one of the worst in his career. "I had to force myself to maintain professionalism," he confessed to colleagues, "but internally, I was devastated. The site was overflowing with onlookers, press, agents, but the doctor firmly ordered, 'Get everyone out of here except essential personnel.'" Near the body, investigators found something disturbing: a plastic bag from a store called Mobio. Inside it were Joan's clothes, a pair of red and white sneakers, a turquoise t-shirt, brown pants, and her blood-stained underwear. What caught attention was how the pieces were carefully folded, as if the killer had all the time in the world. Before removing the body, a priest was called to perform a rite of passage for Joan, respecting the Catholic faith of the family. To spare the parents the trauma of identifying their daughter's body, an FBI agent who lived in the neighborhood made the official identification. The autopsy revealed the horror that Joan went through. The girl had been beaten, strangled, sexually, abused, and beaten to death. The medical examiner determined that she remained unconscious but alive for at least 30 minutes before dying. He also found that the killer probably wasn't sure Joan was dead after the first strangulation, and, to make sure, performed a second one, evidenced by 2 distinct injuries in the neck area. According to McGowan's confession, he asked Joan to enter his house saying he needed change to buy the cookies. When she showed resistance to going down to the basement with him, McGowan grabbed her and forced her into his room. Although he insisted that he never completed the act, McGowan admitted to becoming aroused, ejaculating on his own fingers and then forcing them against Joan. The proof was in the evidence. The girl's underwear contained her blood and his semen. The medical examiner confirmed the hymen rupture, a rape, regardless of the form of penetration. Then came the moment of cold decision. She could not leave there alive. Joan would be able to identify him, would tell everything. His life, his career as a teacher were at stake. Initially, he strangled her on the bed, but thinking about the practicality of cleaning, he dragged her to the tiled floor and continued until she stopped breathing. Believing he had killed her, McGowan went to get dressed. He was sweaty from the effort. He fetched plastic bags from the garage, and upon returning realized with horror that Joan was still moving. What followed was a brutal demonstration of murderous determination. He strangled her again, placed plastic bags over her head, and, when blood began to flow from her nose and mouth, he beat her until he was absolutely certain that life had drained from that small body. McGowan used old t-shirts to clean up the blood, wrapped the body in an old rug, placed it in the trunk of his car, and drove to the park to dispose of the body. On the way back, he threw the bag with his clothes and the rug into a trash bin. Upon returning to the neighborhood, he cynically joined the search for Joan. In his testimony to the psychiatrist, McGowan said that, as soon as he returned home, he began to feel better for having disposed of the body and was able to sleep very well. Joseph McGowan, 27 years old, was a chemistry teacher. Although he didn't have many friends, he had co-workers. The teachers who taught with him found him strange. He had mentioned a fiancée, but never introduced her to anyone, and the relationship had ended shortly before the crime. One colleague reported that McGowan found humor in things that weren't funny, sometimes morbid. He was so unpopular among other teachers that during that Easter week, several of them organized a group trip and deliberately didn't invite him. He was also known for being a brown-noser to the administration and reporting colleagues for minor infractions, such as leaving a door open, which made him an unpleasant figure in the workplace. Most students apparently liked him, but later, after his arrest, some girls reported discomfort in his presence, saying he looked at them strangely and was sometimes violent in demonstrations with other female students during science classes. The psychiatrist who evaluated him concluded that McGowan presented a significant history of sexual attraction to young girls, along with the clear and evident scenario of a dominant and overprotective mother. This indicated deep problems in relating naturally to adult women, which could have been a contributing factor to his deviant behavior. In his sessions, McGowan admitted to having felt attraction to a 12-year-old cousin who slept at his house, and to a girl who sat on his lap when he was a camp counselor at 19. These incidents, although they did not result in criminal actions at those times, already demonstrated the disturbing pattern of attraction to minors that would culminate. In the attack on Joan McGowan, and his lawyers decided to waive a trial, and he pleaded guilty on June 19, 1974. During the hearing, Rosemary noticed something disturbing. McGowan's mother, Genevieve, was staring at her with looks of pure hatred. Later, Rosemary would discover through a mutual acquaintance that Genevieve blamed little Joan for her son's fate. If it weren't for her, Joseph would never have killed and wouldn't be in prison. A perverse inversion of reality, where the murdered child became guilty and the murderer a victim. On November 4th of that same year, McGowan was sentenced to life in prison, but with a disturbing legal loophole: the possibility of parole. After just 14 years, a flaw in the system that Rosemary would tirelessly fight to correct in the following decades. Joan's funeral took place 2 days after the discovery of her body. School friends and Girl Scouts sent cards of condolence. However, as time passed, Rosemary found herself alone in her grief. She still had 2 children, Mary and Frank Jr., to raise, and did everything possible so they could continue having a normal life. Mary wanted to be a Girl Scout like her sister, and despite the pain it caused, Rosemary supported her, not wanting the trauma to negatively affect her daughter's choices. The family decided not to move from the neighborhood, as it would be too drastic a change after the trauma. This meant that Rosemary could see the house where her daughter was murdered daily, a constant reminder of the tragedy. She tried not to be overly protective of her other children, allowing them to play in the street and have a normal childhood, despite her own suffering. She talked openly with them about what had happened to Joan and took them regularly to the cemetery to visit their sister, who was in heaven, keeping Joan's memory alive in the family. Instead of hiding the truth, Rosemary talked openly with her children about Joan. Regularly, she took them to the cemetery, explaining that their sister was now in heaven. It was her way of keeping the memory alive, of teaching that love remains, even after death. The shockwaves of the tragedy continued to reverberate. 7 months after the murder, Rosemary's father, who deeply adored his granddaughter Joan, died of cancer. Doctors suggested that the emotional shock accelerated his physical deterioration. It was a second devastating loss. 1 year after losing her daughter, as if fate wasn't satisfied with her suffering, Rosemary was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a cruel autoimmune disease that causes debilitating muscle weakness, intense pain, blurred vision, slurred speech, and difficulty chewing and swallowing. Doctors never categorically stated it, but suggested that extreme trauma could have triggered or accelerated the condition. Despite the tragedy and the disease, Rosemary had 2 more children in 1980 and 1982, Michael and John, who joined the already teenage Mary and Frank Jr. in 1987 due to sentence reduction. McGowan became eligible to request parole, which was denied. In 1993, Rosemary began an active campaign to prevent him from being released and to change the legislation. She organized vigils, marches, and events to remember what had happened to Joan and to warn about the vulnerability of children. During 3 years of full-time activism, Rosemary transformed her pain into concrete action. Her perseverance finally bore fruit on April 3, 1997, when Governor Christine Todd Whitman, wearing a green ribbon on her lapel, Joan's favorite color, signed the historic Jones Law. This legislation fundamentally altered the New Jersey Penal Code, ensuring that anyone convicted of murder with the aggravating factor of sexual abuse of a child under 14 years of age would receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The impact of Rosemary's struggle transcended state borders. On October 30, 1998, President Bill Clinton signed a federal version of Jones Law, extending protection to children across the country. 6 years later, on September 15, 2004, New York Governor George Pataki symbolically chose Harriman State Park, the same place where Joan's body had been found, to sign the state version of the law. Unfortunately, McGowan would not be affected by Jones Law, as it could not be applied retroactively to crimes committed before its enactment. He continued to request parole over the years, always denied thanks to Rosemary's efforts and the support of professionals like John Douglas, former FBI agent and pioneer in criminal profiling. John Douglas became known for his work interviewing serial killers and developing criminal profiling techniques, being one of the founders of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. His work inspired characters in The Silence of the Lambs and series like Mindhunter. Douglas interviewed McGowan in depth, using his technique of informal conversation without notes to gain the prisoner's trust. What Douglas discovered was chilling. McGowan confessed that the moment he saw Joan through the glass door, he knew he would kill her. He described 2 types of anger: red, which he could control, and white, uncontrollable. When asked which he felt upon seeing Joan, he replied without hesitation, "White." When demonstrating the expression on his face during the crime, McGowan displayed what Douglas described as an intense and evil smile of satisfaction, revealing the pleasure he had felt in the brutal act. McGowan also revealed something that demonstrated his calculating nature even after decades in prison. He had more than $600,000 saved in a bank in New York State from the inheritance left by his mother and grandmother and from the sale of the family home. He explained with a certain pride that he had transferred the money to another state specifically so that Rosemary could not access it through civil lawsuits. Thus, he ensured funds to continue his legal battle for freedom. Douglas was so deeply impacted by this interview that he later wrote an entire book dedicated to the case, The Killer Across the Table. His professional conclusion was unequivocal. McGowan continued to represent a serious danger to society. The story of Joan D'Alessandro is not just the story of a horrible crime, but also of how a mother transformed her pain into action, creating a legacy that protects other children. Jones Law ensures that predators like Joseph McGowan spend the rest of their lives in prison, without the possibility of returning to the streets and causing more harm. A curiosity about the case is that a singer named Nolan Neal wrote a song in tribute to Joan with touching verses that say, "Johan, send me a butterfly and let it be the color of your eyes. Show me a shooting star. In the second I'm wondering where you are." Let me hear our favorite song the next time I turn on the radio. If you're up there on the other side, send me a butterfly. The social butterfly, as her teacher called her, who didn't like to see anyone alone, who settled fights and had empathy for everyone, had her life brutally interrupted at 7 years old. But her name and her memory continue to live on through the laws that protect children across the country, a tribute to the love of a mother who refused to allow her daughter's death to be in vain. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for following this tragic but important story. Don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already subscribed, and share with friends who might be interested in real cases like this. Your comments about the case are very welcome and help keep the memory of Joan and all the victims whose stories we tell here alive. Until the next video.